I think people have just no clue to what extent do these companies collect and store and then resell and reshare all that sensitive information about them,
Yeah.
which in and of themselves may or may not be, problematic or sensitive. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But when they
Mhm.
are combined, and again, this is something that I think we should get into, when combined, they can reveal mind-blowingly accurate predictions about things that you wouldn't even, think when you share, for instance, your data about your heart rate.
Right.
Um, just to give you an example, the changes in your heart rate can, especially if it's combined with, for instance, facial expression changes, can give away very accurate cues about who you are attracted to or what your biggest fears are.
All right. Today, I would like to welcome Julia Keserű to the show. Julia is an activist and writer working at intersections of technology and justice. Over the past 15 years, she has advised numerous organizations on their data and technology strategies, written extensively about challenges and opportunities of data-driven systems, and led diverse global teams to create healthier and safer online world. Julia, welcome to the RVA Running Man podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Devin. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. A really interesting conversation that we're going to have. I've reached out to Julia because the conversation we're going to have today, we're discussing biometric data, biometric tracking, the different applications that are used, in particular for runners. A lot of us use smartwatches and other applications to track our fitness and what companies actually do with that fitness, do with that data, the potential risk and positive things, and just exploring that question. So, Julia, first question for you. What got you into activism and technology? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Thank you so much for that question. What got me into technology? I've been an activist my whole life.
Hmm.
Actually, my whole adult life.
Okay.
I have always worked with civil society organizations. I don't know why. I think I just had this calling that, or this notion that I have to do something in my time that can change the world for the better, that actually has an impact on people, that is positive. So I decided very early on that I want to be an activist, and I have been an activist ever since. But what got me in technology was a very particular organization that I worked with here in Hungary, where I am from.
Okay.
This organization is an anti-corruption easy topic organization that used emerging technologies, data-driven technologies to uncover corruption and also to provide investigative journalists with innovative new tools for their work. And mind you, this was 15 years ago.
Okay.
So, machine learning algorithms were not so popular as they are these days. And just the idea of using so much technology and using the power of the internet was new to pretty much all of us. And I think back in the days, we kind of thought that technology was this, or the internet was this revolutionary space
Yeah.
with endless possibilities for everyone, right? So I think there was always also a lot of well-intentioned naivety in how we approached technology and data back in the days, but that's kind of how it started. I got really excited about the potential. And I even moved to the States for a couple of
Okay.
years. I spent some time from my life in Washington, D.C., and I worked with the Sunlight Foundation. Sadly, they do not exist anymore, but it was an organization that used and created innovative tools to keep the US federal government in check. They created databases around campaign spending and government agency spending, and it showed the ways in which data can be um, displayed and presented and provided to the people in structured and easy to access formats. Because back in the days, most government agencies were hiding behind PDFs when they were trying to, do good by transparency.
Hmm.
But I have to tell you, in the last couple of years, or not so much the last couple of years, but the last decade or so, the the focus of my attention and my activism shifted a little bit.
Okay.
And it mostly happened because I have encountered more and more ways in which emerging technologies, data-driven tech has been harmful and was causing harm to certain communities, especially to vulnerable and oppressed communities across the world.
Right.
And and I was trying to focus more on understanding what is it that actually works and what is it that does not work from our online systems. Because the internet and AI and data-driven tech is still pretty new.
Hmm.
And there's a lot about our online systems that are not working and are not good for everyone. So that was my focus in the last decade or so.
I found you through your work at the Mozilla Foundation and the Engine Room. So, can you tell us a little bit about what your work has been and the type of projects that you've been doing with both organizations?
Sure. Happy to tell you more about these two awesome organizations that do really important work, I believe. First about the engine room, mostly because I spent the last of, or the majority of the last decade with this organization. And I spent 5 years leading the organization. The engine room is a globally distributed, completely international remote team that does essentially two things. They provide technology support to human rights and social justice activists,
Okay.
mainly under-resourced activist communities. So think, Latin American anti-corruption organizations, women's rights groups in sub-Saharan Africa. So in contexts where that kind of pro bono support is even more helpful and needed. And the other thing that the engine room does and does really well, I believe, is conducting original research
Okay.
about the societal impact, about the actual impact of emerging technologies. And we were pretty much, the first ones or amongst the first ones to say out loud that, for instance, collecting biometric data from refugees in a refugee camp is a very complicated and ethically, ambiguous project, to say the least. We were amongst the first ones to say, predictive software, even if it's well-intentioned, can reinforce existing biases and existing oppressions because it uses traditional historical data that was collected in circumstances or under circumstances and in situations that were not fair and equal. So a lot of what the engine room did and still does is raising awareness and looking at new technologies, looking at what's, coming on in the market and what, for instance, humanitarian organizations are pushing, um, and analyzing what they actually do, what are the good things about these tools, what are the good aspects of
Right.
predictive analytics software or biometric data collection or socially assistive robotics, et cetera, et cetera. And what are the things that you really need to pay attention to if you want to do technology in a responsible way, and especially if you are in charge of the lives and well-being of vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
So I'm actually really, really proud of the organization. I did not co-found it. I joined it later on, but I think we did some really pioneer work in the background, raising awareness and gathering evidence on the harms of technology.
Fitness tracking biometrics is a common thing with running, at least for me. I use my smartwatch to track most of my runs, which you can track data like your distance that you're going, your speed, and some other metrics. And then sometimes I use my phone that have applications that track similar data. But what was eye-opening to me is that some of these companies out there can share your data if you don't properly opt out of it. It's not all that clear unless you read the privacy policies that they have. But can you share some insight through the research that you've done, what these companies actually do with the data that they collect from us?
So it- I've been looking at these companies and other tech companies for about 10 years.
Okay.
And what I'm going to kind of summarize to you is not going to be anything new.
Right.
There has been evidence there's evidence that has been gathered in the past decade. I should say that points to a really dystopian
Oh,
and brilliant and problematic data handling ecosystem or data ecosystem. Um, let's start with what they collect. I think you give a really extensive list, but it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of the information and data points that these companies collect about you are not necessarily are not immediately problematic by nature, or when you look at it.
right.
But it's a lot of biometric data combined with sensitive information and location data, right? Your heart rate, your pace, your workout routes,
Yeah.
so much information about where you are and what you do and how your body reacts to a workout routine. And I think what is really striking, and that was confirmed by my own research, where I did a public survey, and I can tell you more about that, but for now I'm just going to mention it. What I find really mind-blowing is that most people have no clue what's happening with their data,
Yeah.
and there's so many different factors behind that, or different reasons why people don't know, and part of that is all those really long and boring and just unreadable privacy policies.
Right.
But really, I think people have just no clue to what extent do these companies collect and store and then resell and reshare all that sensitive information about them,
Yeah.
which in and of themselves may or may not be, problematic or sensitive. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But when they
Hmm.
are combined, and again, this is something that I think we should get into, when combined, they can reveal mind-blowingly accurate predictions about things that you wouldn't even, think when you share, for instance, your data about your heart rate.
Right.
Um, just to give you an example, the changes in your heart rate can, especially if it's combined with, for instance, facial expression changes, can give away very accurate cues about who you are attracted to, or what your biggest fears are, or what drives extreme emotions in you.
Yeah.
And what happens is that, obviously, I want to believe that most companies do not collect this information because they want to be able to blackmail you in the future with that uh, conclusion. But most companies collect that information because they want to better understand their users' habits and preferences. It helps them, create more targeted services. It helps them improve their services. And it also helps them, just be more profitable, to be quite plain.
Yeah.
And and so what you're doing is you're giving away all that data because you want to get better services, and that's the baseline that you need to do for that.
Hmm.
Uh, and then what they do is that they create really sophisticated profiles about you. They keep all that data. They don't really actually explain to you what exactly do they collect and how do they retain it, and how do they archive it, and how not. And very often they share it and sell it to data brokers, to other companies, to advertisers, to anyone who is interested in that data.
Right.
And even if they don't sell it, a lot of that information just gets online. Like, I remember the story where unsecured data from Fitbit and Apple's Health Kit just continued to appear online because of some security flaws. Or I don't know if you remember the MyFitnessPal data breach,
Hmm.
which I think affected nearly 115 million users, including maybe you. Okay.
Yes.
And those instances are very common, increasingly so, not just in the fitness or the running app segment of the industry, but in the biometrics industry more broadly. If you were following the news this year, 23andMe, a genetic testing company, went bankrupt. And they basically put up all of the genetic data of millions of users up for sale for anyone with the means to buy it. So,
Wow.
to summarize, there is a wild, wild west
Yeah.
mentality in the data sharing practices and data handling practices of these companies. And I think people should really start caring about that.
Yeah. And I know there's there are the negative things and there are the positive things. You, and I hope you don't mind me kind of mentioning this in one of your lectures, you explained how biometric data collection helped you with your own diagnosis from breast cancer,
Yes.
but it took away from kind of the personability of kind of getting that data from a doctor. Am I off base with saying that?
No, no, you're not. I actually learned about my um, metastatic cancer, not distant, so I'm good. I'm actually
Okay,
healthy. I wouldn't say
great,
that out
great,
loud upfront, but I had what is called a loco-regional metastasis, which is
right,
the cancer getting into the lymphatic system.
yeah,
And I learned about that from the Hungarian public health record system. So there
wow,
was no doctor involved, right? I
wow,
sat in front of my computer and I just read the words and then I Googled everything and then I translated the Latin doctor words into easy to understand Hungarian for myself. And then
right.
I was there alone with my pain and the news. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and I'm glad to hear that, are better, things are fine. Again, it talks to the positive side of data sharing or biometric sharing, but as you kind of just went over about the negative sides of data integrity getting out there, and to me, the need of some type of regulation when it comes to data collection. In your research, what was something like that look like that will safeguard the consumer from potential negative sides of companies uh, mishandling your data?
I think at this point, it's not going to be one thing, you
Right,
know. It's going to be it's going to have to be systemic change, and it's going to have to be a combination of many things.
right,
And I also want to mention, and maybe I should start with this, if you don't mind. I want to
sure,
start by saying that we don't have to wait for new legislation to happen. Legislation happens very slowly. It is bound by the law being complex and just the pace of it is very slow. And especially with new technologies, that creates really significant discrepancies between the reality of data sharing and data collection versus what the law says.
right,
I'm the EU, which means that I'm protected under the General Data Protection Regulation of the Union,
okay,
which is considered to be one of the most stringent data protection laws in the world. It has its own flaws, and it's getting very outdated because the technology is changing so fast. Um, but I have to say that's not actually true for many people who are using these apps. So for all of us, I want to start by saying we have options, and those options are limited, obviously. So you're not gonna, change the world by opting out of all these tools, and it's
Yeah.
not even what I would recommend.
Yeah.
But I think we can become more conscious digital citizens, the same way that we are trying to be more conscious citizens and more conscious with the environment.
Hmm.
Um, I think we can be more conscious with our digital consumption. And that means we can opt out of data sharing whenever possible. And I know that those privacy policies are incredibly, annoying to read through, but sometimes it means
Yeah.
that we have to, and we should invest in trying to understand what is being collected about us because increasingly the data protection laws that are in place provide us with the information about that if we search for the information. I
Okay.
also want to say, and I want to mention the Mozilla Foundation, which I think I didn't explain in full detail because I was saying so much about the engine room.
Sure.
But the Mozilla Foundation that you also asked me of is another really important player in the digital rights field. It's an organization that promotes a trustworthy and accessible internet, and I'm sure many of your, listeners are familiar with the Firefox browser, which is the most,
Yeah.
popular product of Mozilla. But it's not the only one, and they create a lot of privacy preserving tools, and they do a lot of research on existing commercial applications, mobile health apps, dating apps, etc. And they have this list, this research, which is called Privacy Not Included, that gives people a really good sense of how these apps and how these companies compare to each other. So going back to what people as individuals can do, I want to really recommend for people and encourage people to look at the options that they have. So, you really want to use a fitness tracker or a running app. Please try to look at how they treat your data because there will be some massive differences in that. Speaking of the law still, but about the individual part, I think it's really important for people to know about their rights and to exercise their rights because again, some level of data protection already exists in most contexts. But if I tell people in the EU that they have the option to ask any company in the EU what data they hold about them as individuals. No, almost none of my friends knew about that. And
Yeah.
GDPR has been around for quite some time. So even if you're not using it, I think it's really important for all of us to educate ourselves.
Right.
And in terms of the law and kind of the regulatory environments, there are increasing attempts to try to regulate the impact that data collection can have on individual users and to put a lot more responsibility on these tech companies to prove to you that they will do everything in their powers and their best to protect that data. Because again, even your innocent looking data on your breeding patterns can reveal so much about you that you don't want to share with anyone on the
Yeah.
dark web.
Yeah.
And companies still are not held responsible and accountable for that. So I think laws could do a lot more. Our regulations should do a lot more in
So is
that
there
front.
a catch 22? Sorry to cut you off, Julia. Is
No,
there a
no,
catch
no.
22 there then? If we're asking companies, just playing devil's advocate, to share more about how they're using our data, and the privacy policy is this long, book of words where most people, the most vast majority of society is not going to go through that whole privacy policy. Does that put the company at a disadvantage or both the consumer and the company, kind of at an impasse because what we're asking of them to do is to be more transparent? Is there a middle ground there?
It's such a good question. It's my favorite devil's advocate question
Yeah,
because what I think is happening there is that we don't even need to look for a middle ground. I've been an activist who's been working around transparency a lot and then privacy a lot. So
yeah,
I kind of gathered a lot of arguments from both sides,
right,
and I know that there seems to be a tension between those two aspects. And yes, they are, two sides of the same coin, but I don't think they need to be conflicting.
right.
I find it really interesting that all these companies who spend millions of dollars on user-centric design
Hmm.
haven't found a way to create a lot more human-centered design process for how they
Wow.
share their privacy policies.
Yeah,
And it's not so much, I think transparency, yes, it requires a certain level of creativity and innovation, but there are so many examples out there. I want
right.
to tell you, when I first thought about this question, I asked ChatGPT to give me a user-centered version of existing privacy policies. Same level
Hmm.
of information, lots of important information, but layered and designed in ways that you can understand and explained to you in ways that you can understand and structured and visually presented to you in ways that are just a lot easier for human beings to consume and to understand than, you know, the words of the law and something that is just very complicated text.
Yeah,
So what I hear that I hear you on that, but I want to say I think it's more about tech companies' willingness
right.
and interest in doing that and making their consent mechanisms, just very inaccessible for people so that people do not actually understand what is happening. Because here's the thing, if people understood what's happening, they would
Mhm.
opt out. And that
Wow.
comes up in every research that we do. And the research that I did with Mozilla confirmed that too. Like when you tell people what is happening, when you tell people about the data breaches, when you tell people about the data sharing, nobody says, "Oh, I don't mind that. I'm really happy giving away my data because it's just data." That does not happen anymore. Maybe it happened 20 years ago, but by now, people really understood what is at stake. So I think companies do that on purpose.
That's scary. That's scary to hear. That most people opt out once they find out what companies are doing with their information. That is really, really scary. Shifting gears into, you had mentioned Chat GPT, and AI has become um, a really big deal here in the States, and I'm pretty sure in the EU as well. Do you feel as AI becomes more and more integrated into our lives, this will perpetuate the problem that we're having with some of the companies sharing our biometric data unknowingly?
Oh, absolutely. 100%, or even more if that existed.
Well,
I also want to, as a caveat, say that I try, whenever possible, I try to refrain from using the word AI. I know it's not going to be possible
yeah.
forever.
Hmm.
But I have been working with machine learning technology for quite some time, and I still like to refer to kind of everything that we're talking about here as machine learning because I think it just describes the phenomenon a lot better. And I think artificial intelligence gives all kinds of weird ideas to people about what this technology does and doesn't.
Right.
It also makes it seem like it's homogenous. It really isn't. It's a lot of different kinds of technologies that are used for very different purposes.
Hmm.
And I would also argue that artificial is not even the best words to describe what's happening because human intelligence isn't necessarily spontaneous either, right? Like anybody who has kids knows that it's not just, it doesn't just happen overnight.
Right.
Um, so I'm going to use machine learning, but we
Yeah.
can you can still use AI. I'm totally fine with it. I'm just trying to be very kind of conscious about
Yeah.
how I myself use the term. So yes, to your question, absolutely. And I think it's also really important to keep in mind that AI or machine learning, and we're not talking about generative AI here necessarily, but
Mhm.
AI more broadly, machine learning more broadly. Um, Machine learning has been instrumental in making biometric data collection as pervasive, as sophisticated, as diverse as it is today. And the reason behind it is that, what machine learning models actually do is that they enable a much faster and better way of recognizing patterns in large
Yeah.
data sets, right? Like that's the common denominator between all these different technologies. And so by now, but back in the days, even 10 years ago, we only talked about facial recognition, right? So facial recognition was really new back then. And we started understanding that biometric data collection is going to be everywhere. But since then, it's all the things that we discussed that these fitness trackers collect, all the health information, but also, and I don't know how many people know this, but there are so many new ways of identifying and verifying people based on their biological characteristics. Like there is software now that can recognize you by the ways in which you move, which is called gait
Yeah.
recognition. There is software now that recognizes you by the way you smell, which is called odor recognition. And AI or
Wow.
machine learning has definitely enabled that revolution. Um, I don't know how many people know that Facebook, for instance, was a pioneer in making facial recognition technology what it is today because they had
Yeah.
all the machine learning superpowers that they had back in the days.
Hmm.
And the dramatic improvement of that technology was enabled by the amount of picture that we all shared about ourselves online, in the early 2000s, and but those didn't still didn't yield good enough results. So all these companies started stealing all the information because they basically realized that if they ask people for consent, like you said, that's not going to yield good enough results. So they might as well just take what they find online. And I don't know who else remembers when Facebook back in the days developed Deep Face, which was a deep learning model that was supposed to make the process of identifying people online on the platform a lot easier. So it basically asked you if you want to be automatically tagged. So I think what we need to understand is that yes, machine learning technologies are not just accelerating, they are driving this entire phenomenon. And it's only going to get, I don't want to say worse, but faster
Yeah.
and more diverse and more pervasive. So we're only just at the beginning of this boom. It's an unstoppable thing, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And the question is, as we go, further into the future, like we have the applications that are on our phones, the smartwatches and things like that, is when we start to introduce things that are within the environment that we don't have control over, that is tracking our data. When does that start to grow? And what say would people have over regulating those things since it's not technically owned by us? So, like how you talked about facial recognition. I did an interview a few weeks ago with a race director, and he was saying how facial recognition is going to be one of the items that they look at in order to ID runners in a race. So I, as a runner in that race, may not necessarily have access to the devices that they're using. But how do we, as a society, police something like that as it continues to grow? And I'm not sure what the answer is to that question, but that's one of the things that kind
Yeah,
of, it wakes me up, and
yeah.
it it's eye opening that we're getting to that, is what I will say. I
I
think. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say I agree 100%, and I do not have an answer to that question, even though I am actually working in this field, and I
Yeah.
should be able to provide you with easy answers. I think, like I said before, it's a combination of so many things that we're going to have to pay attention to. But I think knowing that you have the right to opt out is a in not in every context, not in every jurisdiction, not in every situation, but in
Yeah.
many cases you do. So, walking the extra mile to understand what you have the possibility to opt out of is really important. And if you mention facial recognition, I want to tell you a story very quickly about the Hungarian government
Hmm.
the Hungarian government banned Pride a couple of months ago. We don't
Wow.
have to get into Hungarian politics
Yeah.
because that's a whole different story, even more depressing to a certain extent. But what they also announced was that they are going to use facial recognition technology to identify people who are going to protest despite the ban, and then find them and punish them accordingly. And I think it's just such a, how do I put this in English? Like if you are trying to fight that as an individual, that's impossible, right? You can't really do anything.
Yeah.
But if you tried to combine your efforts with other people around you who are equally frustrated and annoyed and devastated and disgusted by the direction where things are going, then we have a much better possibility
Yeah.
to fight some of these changes. And I think asking for as much transparency from these companies who are developing these technologies, even if we cannot stop the direction of things, that's gonna
Ju-
that's gonna help us.
So, Julie, my last question for you. Uh, and we talked about privacy policy and how people can protect themselves by reading the privacy policies of a lot of these companies that use their applications or devices. What are some other ways a person can protect their personal data from being shared if they're not reading their privacy policy or privacy policies as provided by companies?
So I think we touched on some of the things that people can do. And again, I want to emphasize that I think people can do certain things, but there's a very significant limit to what we can achieve as individual users. I would still recommend and encourage everyone to do whatever they can, but also keep in mind that the biggest changes that can happen are going to happen at the regulatory oversight level,
Right.
and in the market dynamics, which still kind of create the conditions. So what you can do, again, going back to the Mozilla Foundation and their privacy not included research, I think people really need to understand that companies and apps and platforms and software can be really different. And there are companies who pay attention to how they handle your data, and there are companies who do not pay attention to how they handle your data. And increasingly, there's research about that is presented to people in very easy to understand and consumable ways. So, do your research when you are downloading a new app, and make sure that you are subscribing to the ones that are more privacy preserving, even if sometimes that comes at the cost of usability
Right.
and comfort, which is what sometimes happens because privacy preserving technologies are very often developed by or from with less money, which means that they cannot, by nature, be as engaging as these other apps are. So I guess what I'm trying to say is make that factor in your decision. Another thing that goes even beyond that is just to rethink, like I think I mentioned this before, but just rethink your overall digital consumption. Like there are things that are built into your phone that you do not need a new app for, which isn't only gonna save you money, it's also gonna, protect your privacy. If you're, for instance, if you want to use a fitness tracker for step counts only, then maybe you can use it or do it with your phone, and you do not need a separate app for that. I know it's hard because we like consuming and apps
Yeah.
are really shiny and I've definitely been there and no judgment. But I think we can try to be a bit more conscious there too. There's something about decentralizing your data too, which is a double-edged sword. But I'm thinking about Google, for instance, and how much, if I use Fitbit, for instance, which was
Mhm.
acquired by Google, but then I also like do all these Google searches about my health and my mental health. Like even just looking at my Google searches would probably paint a very sophisticated picture of both my physiological and mental health profile.
Mhm.
Um, hopefully nobody's downloading the entire, search history. But just thinking about that and how much information is accumulated at the hands of these companies, is giving me a lot of goosebumps, not the good ones. So I think
Okay.
decentralizing that and thinking about, sharing data with different companies, which sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes it's better to actually have smaller companies have access to your data than one big company having access to all your data.
Yeah.
On the other hand, many of these bigger companies are a lot better at protecting your data because they have the means to do that, and it's in their financial interest too to do that. So again, I would recommend for people to do the research and do some thinking about how they share what they share. And then obviously, the very boring you know, cyber security protections that you can do for yourself, which isn't going to protect you from a company resharing your data with a third party company, but it is
Yeah.
going to protect you or can protect you from, someone trying to hack into the system using your weak passwords. So, use strong passwords, use two-factor authentication, everything that
Hmm.
is beyond your or within your means to protect yourself. And I
Yeah.
also want to say, just let's put some more pressure on tech companies. Let's put a lot more pressure on the
Yeah.
industry. It is because if you think about kind of the cyclical nature of capitalism and how certain industries have become big and unregulated and also used those periods of under or unregulation to create as much profit as they could, very often by abusing human rights and stepping on vulnerable people. This is happening with tech companies too. So I want to encourage everyone to think about it as a citizen, as a responsible person. Like we gave so much power to these companies. And there are a lot of practical things that we can do to, at least to a certain extent, reduce that power.
Well, Julia, I appreciate the conversation today. And also, I want to plug this for you because this is your article, Data Body Integrity: Imagining a Digital World That Centers Dignity, is a great article. People, please check out Julia's work. Julia, again, thank you for joining the show today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for asking all these really important questions. It was an honor.